It's so much fun. It's like a director. There he is. Wonderful. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out on our continuing Phoenix polar vortex. I can't remember the last time when I had to cover up plants, and it was, we live in a little wind tunnel, so if it's going to be like 38 or 40, the bougainvillea's toast and everything else. So, can anybody else remember when it was this cold?
Been many years.
Long time. Now, Charlie.
Well, to
Charlie
anyone
Finch.
watching on the live stream, I want you to know it's 60 degrees here. Everyone I've met in Scottsdale is like, I'm so sorry about the weather.
It's not 60, it's in the 50s. But anyway,
Okay,
you are a refugee from Chicago and Los Angeles.
That's right. Yeah.
Right, so you're an even bigger weather wimp than we are.
It's true. It's true. I was in Chicago for 5 winters, and eventually we decided, okay, we were going to go away and we went away for the one when the river froze, which never happens. So we went away for the right one.
Seriously, if you went down to Wabash and looked at the river, it was frozen?
Frozen solid, yeah.
Oh my God, I can hardly remember that from when I was a kid.
Can you hear me? Can everyone?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
It could have been like Holland, where everybody could have put on skates and skated up and down the Wabash,
Exactly.
looking at the Frank Lloyd Wright architecture as it passed by you. I love that. So the other interesting thing I learned about Charlie at lunch, because as you know, all authors who come here, we go out and celebrate either before or after. So much fun. That he has a young daughter who's in a French school in Chicago who was able to go to a French school in Los Angeles. So she's fluent in French, and her father could barely keep up, n'est-ce pas?
It's true. It's true. We're ready for the French invasion if they ever declare war on us. We're gonna fit right in.
So, are you going to send Charles Lennox to Paris?
Ooh, that's a really good idea. Everyone forget you heard that. I don't. Yeah, I would like to. I mean, when were they at war? Do you know the exact chronology? They were at war every 6 years for 100
I
years.
don't think when Lennox is. You could either do it in the prequel because you have one to go.
That's true.
Or.
Yeah.
Yeah, or
Am
later.
I in therapy? Is this?
I thought you came here for plot ideas.
I'll take them.
We've already had a couple of interesting discussions about future books over lunch, so a really good idea.
It's true. Barbara's an amazing.
If I say the words Angela Thurgold, will anyone know what I'm talking about? She continued to write the Barsetshire books that Anthony Trollope wrote. One of my mother's favorite authors, and I have read all of her books, and they are wonderful. But she was a relation of Trollope, I think, and as a result got to continue to write the Barsetshire Chronicles right up into the mid-1950s. So.
And I'd never heard of her. I have to go chase these down because I'm obsessed with those books, the originals.
Me too.
Yeah,
Love
they're
it.
so great.
But why don't we talk about your book just for fun?
Oh, okay.
Which is called, as you can see here, The Vanishing Man, and I love this, is the second in a prequel trilogy before A Beautiful Blue Death, which is the first mystery solved by Charles Lennox. What inspired you to write a prequel, let alone a trilogy prequel?
Oh, good question. It was a trilogy, a little bit by accident. Okay, well, I will say, so I think that the worst book I've ever written is A Beautiful Blue Death, the one you just mentioned, the first one, because I did not know what I was doing. It takes like a couple, you have to like put your toe in the water, but please buy it anyway. But
You have to start somewhere.
Yeah.
This is true, right?
I look at it now and I see so many mistakes. Like I wrote it for 220 pages and I had no idea who the murderer was, which now that I think about it is insane. Like I had no idea what I was doing, and so I wanted to sort of restart the series in a way that I would like be more proud of. Does that sound silly? And I also wanted to write about Lennox before he was quite so comfortable. I wanted to get him off of his. So I had written 10 books in the series, and I was really pleased with the last 3 or 4. But he had kind of reached a stage in his life where he had a family, and he had success, and he had all this stuff. And I wanted to get him back to the age when he didn't know how it was all going to turn out. And he was maybe scared and hungry, and everyone of his class, I don't know if any of you have read The Woman in the Water, which precedes this book, everyone in his class sort of looks down on him for being a detective because you weren't supposed to work if you came from the gentry back then, or the aristocracy. I guess the shortest answer is that, writing a series is a long journey at close quarters. You are with the characters day in and day out, and it really revitalized my interest in writing it and in the era to go back a little bit and think about, okay, well, what was he like when he was 23 or 22?
Well, as I suggested to Charlie, I've had this conversation with I don't know how many authors. You always start a series somewhere. It's just an arbitrary somewhere, where you decide you're going to write about these characters, and they're some age and they have some history and all, but you can't put it all in there. For one thing, there'd be no room for the mystery plot if the whole thing were like a biography of Charles Lennox when you wanted to start, right?
Right, that's how J.R.R. Tolkien did it. He wrote like a 1,000-page book about the history of elves and then started The Hobbit, which is, if you have the patience for that, that's a really good way to do it probably. But
Well, he was an Oxford Don and had a guaranteed income, so...
Well, don't try to embarrass me.
Well, you studied at Oxford.
That's true, but I'm not like him. He was,
I had a tutor at Oxford, and I'm trying to remember, I think his name was Mr. Finch, and he lived...
That's not possible. Am I immortal and I just didn't know it?
Maybe that wasn't it. I'm trying to remember. Who's the guy that wrote An Instance of the Finger Post?
Ian Pears.
Thank you. Ian Pears's wife, Ruth, took my guy's position. So when I had lunch with Ian in Oxford, I got to go and see Ruth living in the 12th century Abbot's quarters at the far end of Worcester College.
That is incredible.
That previously my tutor lived in.
That is amazing.
But here's the thing. It's so cool. But when you lose your job, you also lose your home and everything to go with it. In the British system, you're only there on borrowed time, for as long. So that's why I brought it up. So, while one thing, it's a good thing to be an Oxford Don, and another thing, there's no real safety net retirement program. You get booted out of the college, booted out of your house, and the next person in takes the whole thing over.
My favorite story about that period, they were called the Inklings, and it was him and C.S. Lewis and a few other people.
And they met in that pub.
And they met in the pub, the Eagle and Child, and they would get together. And so it was J.R.R. Tolkien's turn to read, and he got up and very solemnly opened his leather folder, and somewhere in the back, he started to read. Somewhere in the back, one of the 10 or 12 of them said, "Oh God, not another fucking elf." Excuse my language. That's the story.
I mean, come on. So C.S. Lewis was doing Narnia at the same time, so I thought there must have been something in the water.
World War II.
Did they also go down river to the trout? Did they hang out at the trout? The trout's my favorite. Yeah. Well, we're digressing. But Charlie actually wrote a book about Oxford. Was one of the reasons I brought this up. So even though you're going, I'm embarrassing you. The truth is, you have written about your time at Oxford.
I did.
In a contemporary novel.
Exactly, like one very personal novel in addition to all my mystery novels. It's called The Last Enchantment. And what happens is the people who love the mysteries tend to hate that book, and people who love that book have no interest in the mysteries. So I'm kind of stuck between,
That's not very flexible. I read them all.
Well, you're a uniquely wonderful person.
Well, I am. There we go. Okay, so anyway, my point being that at some point, I think virtually everyone I know who has written a long series is compelled to go back and write a prequel.
That's
because I'm going to have this conversation with CJ, because this is book 19 for Joe Pickett coming up. You're going to love this. In the Wolfpack, the new CJ box, Scottsdale is a hunting ground, and the Poison Pen Bookstore is the bait. And the assassin is at the Valley Hope. It's so much fun. He warned me, but I saw it. She says, "I'm trying to find directions to the Poison Pen." "What's that?" the guy says. "It's a bookstore." "A bookstore?" So much fun. But anyway, he hasn't done that yet with Joe. But I mean, it seems to be a perfectly natural thing that if you've created somebody, you would want to know more about their life before you brought them to life on the page.
It's so true. You want to, you learn more about the characters with each book, but that sort of diminishes over time if you have like an Hercule Poirot type, where it's just sort of the same kind of like playing cards being reshuffled.
Right. But if you're writing chronologically,
exactly,
the only way you can go back is to do a prequel. You can't suddenly, drop it back in time.
Yeah, exactly.
And it's more interesting in a lot of ways because we already know about how his life is turning out in regards to his wife and whatever. But when you read the prequels, he doesn't know. And you know, so it's kind of fun. You, the reader, get to know more about him than he actually knows.
Well, and it just occurred to me that I'm now turning. I'm 38, and I wrote the first book when I was 24, and and he was 38 or 39 in that book, and now I'm writing about when he was 24. So maybe I don't know what I did. Is anyone good at math? But I mean, maybe I was curious, like, okay, what did that all mean in my 20s? What was I, because I was so worried all the time in my 20s. I was like, will I publish a book? Will I do this? And now I'm just sort of like, you know.
Right, so you're getting, in this book, Lennox, two things. He's still coming to terms with his wish to be a private detective. And, you know, the old paradigm of a lord's younger sons, either one goes to the military and one goes to the church, isn't quite so strong in the area that you're writing about. The military, I mean, yes, he could go into the army.
But that was still the model. I mean,
it was.
Yeah.
So he's looking for, having ruled out the church, he's looking for some equivalent to becoming a knight. And so a private detective in its own way is very much like that.
I think I wanted him to have one grand eccentricity. So in many ways, he's like a person of his time, but he just does this insane thing where he decides to become a consulting detective. And I love spending time with him. So to get to know him when he was younger, it really is a conversation with the characters, the main characters.
The other thing that's true in this book is that he's lost his father. So he's having a really hard time with his grief and trying to adjust with that. And so it's an interesting contrast in the story, without giving much away, that the Duke who hires him is a terrible father. And so there's a contrast there between Lennox and his love for admiration for his father, and then this man who hires him.
Right. So the mystery in this is that a Duke, the distance between a Duke, I try to convey this in the very first chapter, the distance between a Duke and even an aristocratic member of society was as vast as the difference between that member of the aristocratic society and a drunk in a ditch. That was how, they were like royalty, virtually. There are only 12 Dukes? I can't remember.
Something like that, and your Duke is what, the number 4th?
And he's the 4th person sort of in the land. So to be called on by him as this young detective is this extremely intimidating thing, and it turns out that his family has a secret, which is that they own the only real portrait of Shakespeare. And so that originated because I got really fascinated. I don't know if you've ever looked. It's one of the most fun Wikipedia pages you can look at, which is possible portraits of Shakespeare. Because there are all these fakes that are so bad that it's there was one that was for a long time considered totally authentic called the Jansen portrait, and it looks exactly like how we imagine him. And then they painstakingly restored it, and just as a totally different person. Someone had painted over it with his, because we have this one image of him, that black and white one.
Right.
But in the last 20 years, there have been 2 portraits. The Sanders portrait, which I love, truly. It's of this dashing young poet. And the Chandos portrait, where he's wearing an earring.
Right.
And both of those are considered plausible portraits of Shakespeare. They all have carbon dated to the right time. They're all, there's a tradition in the family. So I go into this a little bit in the book without trying to be too heavy-handed with the research, but I feel like we should know what Shakespeare looks like, so I wanted to write about this lost portrait of him, and that's why the Duke calls on Lennox.
There's a lot we should know about Shakespeare that
That's so true.
Amazingly, we don't. It's really, he was sort of lost years, and nobody knows for sure who wrote
exactly.
what. And it's a constant topic. I think
Yeah.
Somebody's always hoping there will be some definitive something
I
that
know.
will appear in the attic of a castle or the monument room or some.
I think it'll happen. I think at some point, probably long after I'm dead, someone will stumble across something that's decisive on all these issues, and we'll know. My favorite fact is that in his lifetime, he never spelled his name Shakespeare. He signed something like 9 different documents, and he spelled it differently every time, because spelling was so fluid back then. So he's just so elusive. So I wrote about that.
Yeah, and there was no copyright, and because
Right.
these plane companies were composed, they traveled and all the rest, there was no definitive edition.
Exactly.
So if you really want to pursue this, the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. has got probably one of the definitive.
Yeah.
There must be one in England. Is it at
The
Oxford?
Huntington is great.
Well, the
in
Huntington
California also has. He was
Right.
obsessed. He bought something like 20 first folios, which now are worth $3 or $4 million each.
But how do we even know for sure they're first folios? I mean, it could go on and on.
Yeah.
And then, of course, did he just steal? You know, plagiarism is in the air at the moment. There's been a whole bunch of different controversies in the last couple of weeks about borrowing stuff, and yet it's pretty clear that Shakespeare actually borrowed many of his stories.
Well, I plagiarized this whole book. I'm just kidding, Barbara. The
And
look
you-
on Barbara's face. Did I get you? Did you
No,
believe me?
you didn't get me, but what I was just thinking about is that you could hit the front page of the New York Times like,
Oh, gosh.
like their former editor, for example, who's,
Oh,
you know,
yeah. That's a great idea. I should
or
invent
Dan Mallory or whatever you'd like
I
to
should
do.
invent a scandal like that where, yeah, I gotta think through this.
You should make the claim often and in public, and somebody will take you seriously.
Yeah, exactly.
And will not describe it as fake news.
Do any of you want to have actually written this book, and then and you can bring a lawsuit against me? And,
Right. So the only thing I will say is it can't be a spoiler for you, because surely you know this, is that even if there is a Shakespeare thing involved in this, you know it can't really survive, right? Otherwise, you'd have to deal with that in the real world. So, you know, that's another thing you know when you read the book. You should know intuitively is that, you know, whatever
or does
it
it
is.
survive under lock and key in the Duke
Well,
of Dorset's?
let's put it this way: it is not surfaced in real life, right?
True.
And that is part of the challenge, really, for coming up. You could pick some obscure playwright, and you could find a manuscript, and you know, perhaps it really does. Didn't Edwin Crispin write? I'm sure one of what's it called? It's not Love's Labor's Lost, but something like that.
Well,
Anyway, the whole crux of he was an Oxford Don. Gervase Fenn was the character, but one of those is a Shakespeare manuscript, and I think it's fed into the fire by accident.
Oh no.
At the end, yeah. But it too has the same problem, which is, you know, it has to be disappear or be destroyed because it's not around.
Well, there are all these records of them performing Love's Labor's Won, which was the sequel to Love's Labor's Lost, and there's no sign of it anywhere in the world. But it's sitting, you're right, in some castle or probably in some, you know, maybe someone brought it over on the Mayflower. We
You know
don't
what the most likely thing is? That it'll be bound into a book. If you know anything about bookbinding, what happened is that they would take spare paper and they would pad the boards of the books before they put the leather over it. And a lot of lost material has been discovered when a book is sent for rebinding by some, you know, some library, and when they take it apart because the boards have warped or whatever, they find.
That is interesting.
Which I think is the most likely thing, that, you know, the idea that there's really just some moldering manuscript or portrait
Right.
in the attic is not that real, but it could survive inside a book. And that was a standard bookbinding
That is
technique.
interesting. Why didn't you tell me this a year ago? What's wrong with you?
You forgot to send me this manuscript early, Charlie. It's
Well,
all your own fault.
Can I ask you a question? I know
Of
you.
course.
Where do you land on the second best bed? Do you know this thing? In Shakespeare's will,
Oh,
he,
right,
he
yeah.
famously left his wife,
Wife,
Anne
his second
Hathaway.
best bed, right?
He said, "And to my wife Anne Hathaway, my movables, which is, you know, furniture and stuff, and the second best bed from the house in Stratford." And people have interpreted that either as an insult to her or as like, this was our bed. This is, you know, because he left most of his stuff to his children. But a lifetime interest in the house and the second best bed for her. And this is books have been written about what does that mean? Was he a cruel, unkind husband or was he a good husband? And I don't know.
And sadly, his son Hammett died.
That's right.
So Hammett might have been destined for the first and best bed, but then it went south. I don't know. Who knows? Maybe he owed somebody money, you know, and paid for it with
Right,
a bed. I mean,
yeah.
there's a wealth of possibilities.
That's how I pay my debts. It's just beds.
Are you in them?
Every month, my credit card, I just send a bed to the.
I love it. Okay, so tell us a little bit, without going any further into the story, tell us a little bit about the Duke, because this is clearly a
Right.
peer of the realm that you created.
Yes, there's all sorts of dukedoms that come back. I mean, what do they call Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex? Yes. So there are all these ones that are dormant or have been extinguished, and one of those is the Dukedom of Dorset, which is the one that I sort of revive and pretend has always existed in this book. And I wanted to write about, I have never really, in all these books, written about the very, very upper class, which, as I say, was as distinct
The Dorsets were at Knoll, right? Victoria
Yeah.
Vida Sackville's West ancestors, which
That's
went
exactly
south
right.
because there was no son. She married Harold Nicholson, did Sissy Hurst, all that other stuff. She was illegitimate, actually, so she could never have been here.
Well, I believe there were some dukedoms that could literally only be passed to the son of the duke, and there are some that could be passed collaterally, so you could pass it to the cousin, the first male cousin, or something like that. So the Dorset one is one that just sort of was extinguished by one person's sterility, or whatever it might be. And so I revive it, and I make it sort of this grand dukedom, and I wanted to write about someone who has not heard the word no for 35 years. Because if you're a duke, you know, you barely know the name of your staff. I mean, you know, you have this whole, and I wanted him to hear the word no a lot. So the whole book is him hearing, like, no, you can't have this. And it's young Charles Lennox, who's 22 and unsure of himself and a little bit cocky, but a little bit insecure, which I'm sure I was and still am. Having to say no to this duke and getting more and more terrified, but having to sort of stand up for himself as a detective and saying, I know what I know, and you're not telling me this, and stuff like that. So I wanted that tension in there.
One of the really cool things, again, not a spoiler, is that because the Duke is displeased with him, Charles is more or less becomes persona non grata in a gentleman's club, which is like social death.
Exactly, yeah. And I had to figure out a way for him to... Well, that's a good moment to find out who your friends are when I go through my plagiarism scandal that we just concocted. I'm going to find out who my real friends are, because some people will. And so he finds out, you know, there are certain people who look out for him and come by and say hello. And his true blue friend, Lady Jane, who's a feature throughout the series, sticks by him and declines an invitation when he's snubbed and stuff like that. And I wanted to write about, I just wanted to make the ground a little less firm underneath his feet, if
Well,
that
but I
makes
think
sense.
it's also a good reminder of, you know, just how terrible a thing the loss of your reputation could be. You could still have money, you could still, you know, but if you were being snubbed by society, it was really like being sent to Coventry, a more modern version. That
It's
is
true.
the modern version. I mean, it was so. It doesn't sound like a big risk to us, you know, like who would care? But for him, it's a terrible risk.
And there was this intense sensibility about your family honor and which, you know, life is much more diffuse now. I don't think people worry about, like, well, maybe they still do, about, like, you know, honoring their father's memory or whatever. But for him, that's everything. That's his identity, is you know, to bring shame to his father, who lived this very upright, wonderful life, would kill him, so.
You know, it's a shame that we've lost that as an engine and an awful lot of mystery, because now shame is just a passport to greater publishing riches and whatever. But there was
That's a quotable line. That's good.
got that out of the New York Times today that was speculating how many more people connected to Trump were about to write books, and that publishers are actually chasing them because, you know, they're so popular. But it's true. But, you know, it's not just that. I mean, you know, not just in politics, but in real life. If you do terrible things, you know, oftentimes it's a road to some sort of weird celebrity and riches and all. But it used to be that, like in an Agatha Christie or whatever it is, you know, that people did kill to cover up shameful things, because the loss of your good name or your reputation was as significant a loss as if somebody swiped all your money or whatever it was, and we've lost that at the moment.
It's a great point, and you know, I mean, it's sort of similar to, I mean, the novel arose as the first truly middle class art form. Like before that, there were paintings for rich people, or there were farces for the poor, or whatever. The novel, you could carry it around with you. It was cheap. You know, a housewife could read it, a husband could read it, and a lot of that was dependent on the marriage plot, because who you married was so vital. And now everyone can get married 17 times. It doesn't matter. You're a Kardashian or whatever. And so that, I think you're right, that the loss of the marriage plot and the loss of protecting the family name, which plays a role in so many Agatha Christie and Dorothy Sayers novels, and, you know, covering up affairs and stuff like that. Now all of that is, you're right, it's conversely become strangely, almost a badge of honor or something.
I think it's harder to create credible mystery plots today than back in the golden age, when, you know, it was a lot clearer. I had somebody, since I do the store Instagram, there was somebody who posted one after I had, I don't know, journals or something on there, that said, you know, why is it called the poison pen? And I thought, well, okay. So I answered because, you know,
That's
started
so
out
funny.
as a mystery bookstore, and this was the gossip channel for Agatha Christie, replaced today. I didn't write all this out because I'm on my phone, but anyway, replaced today by Twitter or whatever it all is.
Well, and the
But poison pen letters.
Is there an
were
equivalent
lethal.
of the poison pen letter these days? What would it be even?
Well,
Do you all know what a poison pen letter is? Like a letter.
Well, it was the way of spreading
imputing
gossip. So, in
someone's
point of
relationship
fact, Twitter
anonymously.
would probably be, the
I think it's
equivalent.
Twitter bots.
Probably.
Yeah, that's probably true.
Or occasional websites that shame people. Like, I don't know, there's one out of business now. It used to go after celebrities and so forth. And that's the other thing. If you become a public figure, you're fair game. People, you can't hide behind much in the way of protection.
Tell me about it.
But you want to overcome that for your plagiarism plot, Charles.
I know, I need to develop the shamelessness gene.
No,
that's
but
why I'm in LA.
You
That's
don't
the real
want the
reason.
protection of being a public figure when you go public with having plagiarized your book. You want people to talk about it. You've got to straighten this out, kid.
I think the poison pen letter, I mean, if you're going to ruin my life and reputation, you should at least have to pick up a pen.
If you think about the mechanics of it, I mean, the forensics then depended on a pen or a typewriter. And there are instances where you'd find like the crooked key on the typewriter would reveal to you that it was so and so who went down to the library or wrote them in the back of the solicitor's office or whatever it is in order to spread this stuff around the village. Which often led, in real life, led people to commit suicide and, terrible things as a result of public shaming. And today, if you think about it, you've got, hackers and stuff, trying to figure out whether this is a real email address. So, I mean, the mechanics of it are actually, the basic mechanics are the same.
But
it's just the
The
technology.
fine mechanics are so different. I mean,
Yeah, but
well, it's interesting because when I started writing this series, so the first book came out in 2007. The one that I like that book in ways, but you always look back and think, oh, I could have done this better or that better. But when I was writing it, that was really the apex of CSI. That was when like the fifth, CSI El Paso was coming out, and CSI Scottsdale Prescott. And I was so tired of them being like, now zoom and enhance or picking up like fingerprint. And I was like, I felt this real urge, like, oh, well, what was detection like back when they didn't, you couldn't just do that. And it's kind of a joy to have one hand behind your back. I think the cell phone has ruined a lot of old mysteries too. Like you get a cell phone, you just call and be like, hey, come get me, I'm trapped in a well.
Now you send people out, for example, to a mountain in Wyoming, again in the wolf pack, and there's no cell reception.
That's right.
Or or the battery's gone dead, or your phone fell in the bathtub, or you have to disable it in order to make it work.
Well, I think Ruth Ware, who I'm not even her hugest fan, but she's found a really smart thing, which is she gets people in a closed setting. So she'll have like a bachelorette party in a house in the middle of the woods where there's no cell reception, and suddenly
She's
two
only
of
written
them.
one good book, in my opinion.
Which one was it?
I'm not a fan either. The one in Cambridgeshire with the mill.
Yeah, that was
Mill.
pretty good.
I hated the first two.
I didn't especially like the one. Well, whatever. Is this a book club? What's going on?
Sorry, Ruth. You're watching this.
Ruth's your biggest fan.
Listen, I don't want to be an all one note, bookseller and reviewer for you. I mean, I think if we don't like something, we should tell you. And you don't have to agree with us. In fact, sometimes my saying I don't like this book creates a stampede for the book.
Yeah, say you don't like this one.
Right.
I asked Barbara, I said, would you tell me if you didn't like the new one? And she said, I just wouldn't invite you. I was like, what a comfort. We've been friends for 7 years now.
Charlie was actually our first writer in residence. It was interesting. I was telling you, we just had Linwood Barkley here, but Charlie and Michael Carita, I'm trying to remember. Very distinguished roster, but there you were.
Yeah, it was such a fun time,
and it got you out of Chicago to Scottsdale
exactly
in February.
And I got to go to Taliesin, and I got to go to a Phoenix Suns game. This all sounds very modest to you because you live here, but for me it was exciting. It was a wonderful week. I loved it.
It was great. It was wonderful to have you here. So you're committed to the third book, and why?
Yes.
Why did you decide on a trilogy? I know a 3-act structure is natural.
Oh, interesting.
But why did you decide to write? Because you could have stopped with this one. Why did you decide to write a third one?
Well, now can I get out of this contract? How do you do that? No, let me. I'm trying to really think of the answer. I think the answer is that I did not want to feel. You know, each of these books has to have a mystery in it, so I'm going to make sure each of them has a discrete mystery that you can solve on your own as a reader. But I didn't want to feel, in terms of the arc of his youth, rushed. I didn't want to try to jam everything into one book and sort of lard it with a lot of detail about what it was like. I wanted him to evolve as a person. As I said, I mean, I think maybe it's my way of looking back on my 20s. I have like a lag in my mind of a decade of what I understand. Like, I'm just now sort of understanding what I was like at 30 maybe. And it's maybe my way of processing what my 20s were like. I wasn't sure if I would have any success. I wasn't sure if I was making the right move. You know, a lot of people from my college went to work at hedge funds or big businesses and stuff like that, and I was like, well, I think I'll try to be a writer, and everyone was like, okay, good luck. That's, you know, I don't know. It's really hard to make a living as a writer and stuff, and so I think maybe it's my way of exploring what I felt like in my 20s. So it's personal in a way to try to. I've always had this sort of like invisible tether between me and this character, and maybe this is a new way of sort of pulling on it.
I wasn't trying to discourage you. In fact, I could actually encourage you to make it like a sextet or something. And I say that because, you know, inevitably when you're writing towards the end of the 19th century, you're marching relentlessly towards a lot of stuff. You know,
A lot of carnage, yeah.
Yeah, and so I think that there's a lot to be said for, you know, but maybe if you do 3, you could switch back and forth. You might not have to keep going forward in the series.
Well, I've always felt, I mean, as we discussed, I wrote this contemporary novel, The Last Enchantment, so I'm obviously not averse to writing contemporary fiction, but I've always felt that I never wanted to catch up with film, because I think, like, there's this very clear marking point in history where you can start watching everything on film. Like, you can watch the Red Scare in 1919 even, they have, like, little grainy footage of all, you know, stuff like this. So I've always wanted it. The Victorian era is so interesting to me because they were like us and unlike us, and because it's the last area that we truly have to really imagine it. I mean, it is so vivid because of the literature and everything like that. So I never want to catch up to modernity in this series. So, yeah, maybe I'm buying myself time. Maybe I'll just go back and back and back.
No, I think that'd be great, right? Lennox in the cradle. You know,
Lennox versus the dinosaurs.
The father child. No, I'm really serious. I think too often writers don't stop and realize when they are writing forward, and especially if they're writing like a year and you know, that they're going to run into something. They might. I think about Connolly and Bosch, or you know, Ian Rankin and you know, and
I think
Rebus.
the Connolly example is great. Yeah.
And so I think, you know, there's a lot to be said for, you know, going back and exploring or slowing it down. So, you know, Lindsay Davis wrote the Falco series. Those books literally started 5 minutes after the last one ended. I mean, she finished I'm trying to remember, the first one was silver, whatever it was. And the next one, the bronze one, literally was 5 minutes.
Was the first line 5 minutes later? Lindsay picked up Maria.
No, but I mean, in other words, you know, it was just really just a continuous story, but you didn't run out of the reign of Vespasian, which is what the whole point of what she was writing. She wanted to write about Vespasian. So she could only write so many books before he disappeared, unless she wrote them right.
Very close.
Yeah, exactly.
That's what I find so fascinating about Sue Grafton, is she's the only writer I can think of who started out writing a contemporary series and it gradually became a historical series, because she was writing from in 84, 85, 86, and
she got up to 89.
Is that it?
Why was in 89? Well, there's no Z.
That's
Z was
incredible.
actually going to be 1990.
Wow.
And she died before she.
That was such a
write it.
touching tribute when her daughter was like, as far as we're concerned, the alphabet
Y is the end
ends
of the
at Y.
alphabet. Yeah. Well, I agree with that.
I
sadly,
love those books.
But, yeah, but that's how far she had progressed. She
Right.
didn't want to make Kinsey the kind of private eye that has to have a hacker in the back room and, you know, a computer specialist and deal.
So you
with
knew
all-
her. Yeah.
Oh yeah, no, she and I are the same age. We were great friends. She debuted all her books here from G.
I really regret never having met her, because I was at the same conference as her a
Yeah.
couple of times, and she was
She
one of my
opened
heroes.
this bookstore. 1,500 people came, and the line went around the bookstore,
Wow.
and around the block twice. And the reason I remember it really clearly, aside from all of that, is it the tortilla factory down here? Some unknown girl got drunk on strawberry margaritas, drifted up the alley, drifted through the back door of the store. Sue was over here and threw up on her.
In my defense,
Customers rushed for buckets. You know,
Oh, no.
we had to borrow clothes for Sue. I mean, it was hard. And then passed out, hit herself on the floor, and the EMTs had to come through the back because she was drunk and passed out. Her skull was being Lord. But anyway, I mean, something like a 1,500 person event is not actually a book event; it's a crowd control event, and clearly we flunked, in that one sense. Although I don't think any one of us could have really anticipated the drift of this.
I don't think I would believe that in a mystery novel if just you left the back door open. There's 1,500 people and in the
That's
back.
because people were going
I
out.
think I'll go through this door.
They came in the store and they wandered all around the store and they went back over there, and so to make the line as long as possible, we put her over there in that
Oh no!
But then they went out that door, so the door was open,
That is
and
so
that's
funny.
how this girl drifted in. Well, anyway, we drifted.
Wow.
So the other thing I wanted to talk to Charlie about, and I thought you might have questions for, is that Charlie, aside from being a great novelist, is a very distinguished book reviewer. He writes in the New York Times and other publications. And recently, he did a roundup of thrillers in the Times. Was it six or eight? Something?
Yeah, something like 6.
And I actually amazingly agreed with him on all of them, which. And so, I guess a real question is, when you're assigned a book to review, what standards do you hold yourself to? Does the Times have them for you, but do you have your own?
That's a really good question. I mean, I've written enough for the Times now that I hope I have a really good understanding with my editor, and I sort of get to gravitate toward the books that I think are going to be interesting and.
Do you get to pick the books that you review?
Within a range, yeah.
You
Like
do.
I don't think I could say I want to review this book about skincare, but as a thriller. But
Is it always thrillers?
no, I review a lot of literary fiction,
That's
but
what
I
I
only
thought.
do roundups of thrillers.
Oh, okay. All right.
And it took me a long time to articulate this, but I think I started so I've written for Slate and the New Yorker and the Washington Post. I write for a lot, and all these places. And I think what I realized eventually is that if you're going to write a review of a book, you have to go all the way into the author's territory. So you can't have any preconceptions about what a book should be. If you read on the cover, this is a book about an assassin staying at the Hotel Valley Ho, you can't think like, well, I hope it's this kind of book. You have to totally give yourself over to their vision. And once you've done that, you have to be merciless. Because I don't think it does anyone any good if you soft pedal your opinions. So you have to start with generosity and then retreat into really the certainty of your opinions, because that's what you're there for. I mean, everyone can go find out what the plot of the book is. Everyone can decide for themselves if they love it. But I think if you're reviewing a book, and I do this even for my one-sentence Goodreads reviews, I think you have to try to imagine what the writer was doing, and you have to think, like, if you don't like it, you have to think, what would a person who likes this like about it? You have to really try to be generous in that way. But then you lock the cell door at a certain point, and you just have to, I think I'm probably saying that because people are like, you're not very nice to some of these writers, and I don't think you can be. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, this question struck me because for those of you who've read the February book news, and if you haven't, rush home and go onto our website and read it. I have a lot of negative comments about some of the books. One I think I wrote where I actually said, don't buy this book. So, whatever.
Signed copies in store.
And no. Truly, I mean, there are some really awful books out there. And, the worst review, from my standpoint, is no review. All right, if I don't mention it, and you have to find it on your own, then that's fine with me. But I don't want to call it to your attention if I can help it. Then there are the reviews where I know there is an audience among all of you for this author, but I don't like the book, but on the other hand, I should make it available to you. So then I have my reviews. I think of this is, here's this book, and I don't say anything one way or the other. It's just a little descriptive thing, and you can buy it or not, as the case may be. The books that we pick for our Book of the Month clubs And the majority of authors who come here, those are the books that I read and try to give you, a real opinion. Either Patrick or I does all the club picks. So why would I pick a book that I think you're gonna not like, and force you to buy it? What would be the point? But then there's some other books that every once in a while I'm just so irritated about, how bad they are. And actually, since I've already said this, Ruth Ware's an example.
Oh no.
I thought that the Whatever It Is in Cabin 10 was an absolutely horrible book. I didn't like anything about it, including the way, just because it's a bestseller doesn't mean that I have to go, it's wonderful. There are a lot of bestsellers that I marvel at how, a lot of them are advertising. I can tell 3 months in advance, you can, how much money the publisher is committed to
Marketing.
this author, to marketing this author. And if they spend enough money, they can make even a bad book a bestseller.
But they can't make people love it. That's what I've discovered.
No,
is
they
that
can't
they
make
can...
you love it, but they can, they can get people to buy it, or it's a name recognition thing. They stroll into a store, and because there's been so much publicity about the name, people...
And they can send them to Book Expo, and they can send them on a big tour.
Or they can get Barnes & Noble to commit to
Exactly.
putting, books up in there. I mean, I've said this before, and if any of you shop in any of those big bookmarts, none of those books are there because the staff recommended them. It's 100% because they are being paid to put those books there. They really are. So you go in and you see, recommended books for this month and all. It's just like serial placement at Safeway. It's exactly the same thing that Kellogg Company paid. So those kinds of books, people think,
I want to get into this cereal thing. Do they really pay to have it at eye level?
Absolutely, yeah. The grocery stores.
So I'm not choosing my own cereal. It's being pre-chosen for me.
I'm just telling you.
I believe you. I'm all in on this conspiracy theory.
And there are authors who have deliberately chosen pen names so they'll be shelved right next to Lee Child, for example. So they will pick a pen name like Childress or or something, because that way they will sit on the bookshelf in the store next to a famous author.
That's kind of smart.
Or crooked, depending on how you look at it. But all I'm saying is that,
I'm always next to F. Scott Fitzgerald, and it gives me this sinking feeling. Me next to the greatest writer.
Which is an asset or not, is the case. Anyway, what I'm saying is that I can't be completely honest in all cases, because I would never invite somebody to come here or agree to have somebody come here and be rude to them. That would be horrible. I don't want it. I got called on this once when I was trashing a book by a best-selling author in front of a very large group, because I absolutely hated it.
You've been down at Tortilla Flats.
And one of our customers stood up and said, but that's not fair, because I like this author, and you are putting down those of us who like this author's books. And I thought, okay, he has a point, and so for me it's a much more difficult thing. You are in a pure environment reviewing for the New York Times.
Right. I'm in the sort of sterile lab conditions of my brain where I can just sort of say, like, did this...
I didn't put it that way.
No, I'm saying that as a positive. I agree
Okay.
with you. Like, you have a duty to your customers and a duty to authors and a duty to your store. I mean, you have like all these conflicting... I can just sort of... But that's why I think I give authors an extra chance. Like with Ruth Ware, I think, for instance, that's a good...
Ruth, I'm really sorry I was all about you.
I was going to say, I think she is a classic example of someone who's really good at coming up with premises and then sort of tries to ride out the energy of the initial premise. And that is often how books fail for me, is that someone will have a really good idea and then they'll try to just like fool you into eking out the rest of it rather than having a full story. So she has a premise. All these women are in cabin number 10.
Right.
And then
where's it go from there? This takes me back to the thing I quote so often that Manette Walters said to me, which I totally agree, is that a book has to have an ending as good as the beginning.
Oh,
it has
great.
to deliver, and unfortunately, as you point out, it's way easier to have a great idea than it is to execute it. There's a lot of saggy in the middle of an awful lot of books, and even good books oftentimes have saggy middles, but
and good people.
It's the end, that you need to put that book down feeling that you were pulled into that story and it was worth your time. Not your money, but your time, okay? Time is the thing that you don't have extra to spare. You know, for every book you read is a book you didn't read, you know. It's the same principle as investing, you know. For every dollar you put here, you didn't invest it there. It's lost opportunity. And that's true for authors, too. And, you know, often we'll have an author here and one of you will say, you know, why aren't you going to write another book about so-and-so? And the answer is because there's some other book you want to write. And if you wrote the book about so-and-so, it's a book, Reese Bowen gets caught with this all the time. You know, why aren't you writing another book about
Molly Murphy
or Evan and all? And, you know, she's only got so much time and she's more interested in this other story. But that's true of you as readers too. You know, you can only read so many books. So there you are. And so I think the point of, you know, reading somebody's reviews is to try to align your taste with whoever this person is. So if they say they didn't like this book, that's a possible time saver for you. If they really like this book, you know, maybe you should at least try it.
Yeah.
You know, and then if you're got to be neutral, in my case, quite a lot of the time, you should be able to tell when I am writing a descriptive review or when I'm writing an actual review, you know, that says I like it.
Well, also,
in fact, I actually say that. I will say, I really liked it.
There's also nothing I want more than to love a book. I go into
me
every
too.
book hoping
Every
that it's going to
single
change
book.
my life.
Isn't that true?
Yeah.
Absolutely. I want every book I open.
And my heart gradually falls as I sort of, but then sometimes
But then
it
there's
rises
some
up
really
again,
happy
yeah.
surprises. Patrick wrote to me the other night. He said, what have you read you like? He said, I'm finding, you know, I'm tired. He said, I want to be excited about something. What have you read that's really different? And the answer was a $16 paperback that I absolutely love by a woman named Katya Ivar. And it's set in Finnish Lapland, and it's one of the most complicated books I've read in ages, and it's wonderful. Now, I don't have any, I mean, how much money am I going to make off sending for the store 10 copies of a $16 book? You know, nothing. So there was no financial motive in that, but, you know, it is the book I thought was the most interesting.
Yeah, we all want to fall in love with a book. I mean, that's why we're,
Yeah,
exactly.
So it's fun. Anyway, we should be done. Ian, can you step away? And
Bye, Ruth.
Probably going to get sued. Bet Ruth will never come to the store. What do you think?
Invited, we know that.
She's English, and so it doesn't really draw her, so I'm not worried about it. I would like to say goodbye to our Facebook audience, and thank you very much for joining us. And if you forward this to Ruth's Facebook page, so be it.
Oh my